I'm here joined by Lois and Jocelyn, fellow research assistant and graduate assistant, also working with the center, who are helping me support NOAA in this event today. We are all today's welcome all to the guest speaker series talk with NOAA Romero. It's great to see you all here. So also please note that this event will be recorded today, but if you can let myself or Lois know via chat message if anyone has any issues with this. And we'll also make sure to edit accordingly. The recording will be shared on the CIER-OAZ YouTube, which is down here, page, and the Deepening Knowledge Project website for later viewing. At the end of today's discussion, we will open the floor for some Q&A and discussion. So I'll hand it over to Lois for the land acknowledgement.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you, Megan. Welcome, Noah. So I'd like to officially open the event by acknowledging the land where the University of Toronto operates, and also to invite anyone who's not in Toronto at the moment to reflect similarly within your own space. So the land that Toronto or Tukaranto sits upon carries the interconnected stories and histories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe nations. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory and shared the necessary knowledge to survive on this land. Tukaranto today is the treaty land and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and is also on land governed by the Dish with One Spoon Agreement to share the land between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations. Toronto is also home today to many Indigenous peoples, of course, from across Turtle Island, as well as millions of other settlers and arrivants who have come recently or not so recently, willingly or unwillingly to this land. I think that acknowledging the land in this way, of course, just represents a very, very small start towards the work of reconciliation and tangible decolonizing work, but it does encourage reflection on how we are personally connected to the land and what our responsibilities are as a result. So for instance, I personally situate myself on this land as a settler of European ancestry. So I have come to recognize the many ways I've benefited from the violent colonial project on this land. This project has worked for multiple centuries to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their homelands, cultures, and knowledges, to instead impose settler European lifestyles and values. And this violence is ongoing today here and around the world. Settler colonial ideologies not only continue to impact Indigenous peoples and communities, but also the land itself through continued environmental destruction. So with this in mind, I think that this virtual space can reflect one of sharing, learning, connecting across borders and time zones so that we can learn and reflect on this kind of work in our own spaces to inspire and encourage action towards fostering reciprocal and caring relationships with one another and with the land.
Wonderfully spoken. Thank you, Lois. So today we have Noah Romero, who is an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. Anyway, he holds a Ph.D. from Waipapa Taumata Rao, the University of Auckland, in the fields of critical studies and education and Māori and Indigenous education. Bridging ethnic studies, critical Indigenous studies, and education, Romero's research examines how dispossessed and deterritorialized people redefine learning and identity in subcultural contexts, with a focus on Indigenous and immigrant communities in Turtle Island, Oceania, the Philippines, and the Philippine diaspora. His first book, Decolonial Underground Pedagogy, Subcultural Learning for Peace and Human Rights, so coming soon. So I'm very pleased to present our speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you so much, Lois, as well, for your just beautiful land acknowledgement. And greetings, everyone. Thank you all for being here. As Megan said, my name is Noah Romero. I am an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies here at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. And I'm from a place called Narvacan, Ilocos in the Philippines. Thank you all again. Thank you to Professor Sandra Stiers. Thank you to Lois, Jody, and Megan, and the Center for Indigenous Educational Research for your graciousness in hosting me today. I'd also like to name that where I sit and where I'm joining you from is unceded Nonotuck, Nipmuc, and Pecumtuck lands and waterways. And I want to acknowledge that Indigenous nations have entertained the empty words and gestures of invaders and opportunists for centuries. So it's important to continually interrupt processes that colonize and dispossess, including in education. I want to honor and acknowledge the neighboring Indigenous nations, including the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan, Pequot, Schaghticoke, and Narragansett to the south, the Haudenosaunee to the west, and the Penobscot, Mi'kmaq, Wabanaki, and Abenaki to the north. With this acknowledgement comes a shared responsibility to work intentionally toward authentic engagement and good relationship with the Indigenous communities who are the rightful stewards of these sovereign and unceded lands. And I don't offer this acknowledgement as a substitute for active reparation or even as an example of it. I offer it simply because I, as a Filipino person, was always taught that if you are a guest in someone's home, that you take off your shoes and show some respect. So let me go ahead and share my slides so I can hide behind them. Yeah. So over the last decade, I've worked deeply with Indigenous communities, as Megan mentioned, in the Philippines, in Aotearoa, and in the United States, the so-called United States. The global nature of that work reflects my own positionality as a deterritorialized Philippine subject standing with the Indigenous peoples of the places where I live and work. I've devoted my life to the study of decolonizing education, or forms of teaching and learning that foster healing, balance, connectedness, self-determination, the rematriation of stolen land, and the resurgence of Indigenous lifeways upon those lands. Decolonizing education, as Lois mentioned, is a response to colonization, or the violent imposition of Eurocentric ways of thinking that have metastasized into the existential crises that face us all today, like climate change, global inequity, geopolitical instability, ecocide. Decolonization then refers to the process of undoing colonialism and creating systems that allow historically targeted communities to exercise their inherent sovereignty and self-determination. And it involves tangible action toward the return of those stolen lands and lifeways, as well as political, social, economic, and educational reparation for the atrocities visited upon and that continue to be visited upon Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples. Decolonization entails the eradication of colonial ways of thinking, the rejection of competition in favor of connectedness, balance, reciprocity, healing, and restitution. Decolonization means that we will liberate our lands, communities, and ourselves by any means necessary. And that's a lot, right? But what my research does, what I like to do as a researcher, is remind us that we don't need to start from scratch, because this is already happening. We just need to know where to look. So today I'll be talking about decolonial underground pedagogy, third spaces of sovereignty. I'll be talking about the liberatory learning that occurs in subcultural communities led by Indigenous and minoritized people. And I'll specifically focus on how the work of the intertribal metal band M.I.S. shows how decolonizing education is a living and breathing reality. And I'd be remiss not to mention that parts of this work appear in a chapter published in a volume called Third Space Explorations in Education, edited by Candace Kay and Jeanette Haynes-Ryder, as well as in my own book, Decolonial Underground Pedagogy, Unschooling and Subcultural Learning for Peace and Human Rights, and that'll be available through Bloomsbury this summer. Again, I didn't want to pay for someone else to do the index, so I have to do it, and that's kind of made it take longer. It's coming, though. The main question that organizes my research is simple. Again, it's how do we decolonize education? And that question is complicated by my own experience, because I didn't come to understand how to do that, how to decolonize education in school, not even in classes about decolonizing education in graduate school. I mean, I learned about it at punk shows, by playing music, by skateboarding, by talking to people, talking to youth and elders and the homies. And that led me to ask, what is it about subcultures that what do subcultures offer Indigenous and minoritized people? And how do those offerings differ by context and place as we navigate colonial terrain? So This paper is about Rez Metal. I've done some research on punk, done research on skateboarding. I will say that since this research trajectory has come together, I'm now studying the most hardcore of all subcultures that I've encountered, and that's ballet. But more on that in the future. The second question is, how does the primarily informal learning that happens in subculture help us advance the political imperatives of decolonization? And how can those insights help us make education more equitable in other contexts, including in schools? How do we make education, how do we create new regimes of truth that center Indigenous values like sustainability, like kinship, and kinship with our human and non-human relatives? Methodologically, the best advice I ever got was from my supervisor, Takaweho Hoskins, and she said, just use Linda. Just get Linda's book and do whatever she tells you to do in there. So I look to Linda Tuhiwai Smith and use decolonizing methodologies like community research, storytelling, and the close reading of texts, cultural productions, and my own recollections, and also practice what is written about in the literature as an Indigenous Philippine methodology called pakapakapa, which translates to feeling around in the dark. It's suppositionist research, and it calls us to immerse ourselves deeply in community life before we ever claim knowledge or even ask questions about that community. All right, so in terms of conceptual constellations, conceptual considerations, to frame this work around Rez Metal in terms of theory, I first looked to Kevin Broyniel, who defines third spaces of sovereignty as contexts and communities that exist on the margins of both settler statecraft and tribal nationhood. And those include, social movements, protest movements, and it's a lot, third spaces of sovereignty are a lot like what Linda Smith describes as communities of interest. Her famous example is like Māori women, Indigenous women's circles that, are feminist movements that are specific to Indigenous self-determination. Third spaces profiled in Broyniel studies include Indigenous activist movements and organized challenges to the U.S. government's efforts to confiscate native lands and undermine tribal sovereignty. The American Indian movement would be a key example of that. Standing Rock, things like that. Third spaces of sovereignty come into being on the borders of dominant political systems, and in so doing, expose the practices and technologies that define the boundaries of hegemonic states while exposing how they work. And because of that, they offer generative educational possibilities. They afford participants opportunities to develop the skills and competencies needed to pursue political awakenings, collective healing, and self-defined goals. If we encounter third spaces as fundamentally educational, it advances our collective understanding of how informal learning, reciprocity, relationships, and courageous engagement can help sustain inclusive and empowering educational environments. And at the same time, third space explorations of education can also illustrate different and sneaky, seductive ways that Eurocentric modes of teaching and learning can traumatize students of color. So the second sort of conceptual touchstone is I bring third space of sovereignty. In order to use third space and sovereignty to understand the pedagogical implications of subculture, I brought it into conversation with previous writing I did on Decolonial Underground Pedagogy. And that is a sort of critical synthesis of literature on Indigenous and decolonizing education, informal learning, and subcultural studies. So in brief, defining subcultures are communities of interest that cohere around recreational or leisure-based activities that are looked at by society, by dominant culture, as frivolous at best or threatening at worst. Subcultures encourage their participants to deviate from mainstream norms that are espoused and promoted and policed by those holding power or seen to be holding power. And that includes politicians, the wealthy, it includes police officers, it also includes community elders, and it also includes teachers. Underpinning subcultural participation is a pedagogical context that compels participants to pursue and define their own educational goals. And the way they do that is mostly through conversation, through observation, through doing things. And the doing is for its own sake, not for an assessed and official educational purpose. That's a key, something that differentiates and delineates underground pedagogy from other forms of teaching and learning, even ones that are specifically designed to promote peace or human rights or social justice or multiculturalism or what have you. I guess the thrust of decolonial underground pedagogy is that the learner arrives at those things, but is in the learner arrives at them in the process of pursuing something else, pursuing learning how to skate, pursuing how to make music, pursuing how to bake a cake, maybe. So to theorize Rez Metal, Native American heavy metal scenes as third spaces of sovereignty, as incubators of decolonial underground pedagogy, it's helpful to consider the particularities of underground heavy music subcultures, and research on punk rock is helpful in this regard. So Seth Con Egan's definition of punk rock, I use it often, consists of 5 key tenets. The first key tenet of punk rock culture is a DIY aesthetic, DIY ethic, a do-it-yourself ethic. Although someone sort of, when I was in New Zealand, a Maori punk queered that framing for me. And instead of do-it-yourself, DIY now stands for Defend Indigenous Youth. But we'll get to that later. So it's a DIY aesthetic. The second is a sense of anger and passion. The third is a sense of destructiveness that calls for attacking institutions when those institutions are oppressive. The fourth is, I don't know if I'm saying the numbers right. The last one in my head was second. Now I'm on 4. Second to last, the penultimate tenet is a willingness to endure or even pursue pain in order to make oneself heard or noticed. And the fifth is a pursuit of the pleasure principle, or a reveling in some kind of Nietzschean chasm. So there is a pleasure aspect, a leisure aspect to punk music, to heavy music. And in educational terms, punks often engage in praxis of decolonization that allow them to learn about injustice and inequality, mostly through conversation and through putting on shows, through community building and the arts. And punk rock subcultures are rife with tensions, and they're not decolonizing by default. But when we understand punk in this way, you can see how that could happen, and how it especially happens when it is by POC folks at the front of punk communities. So heavy metal has a lot in common with punk, but it also has a distinct history that differentiates it from punk, and it's largely leftist origin points. Heavy metal bands range from gross party boys like Motley Crue to overt white supremacists like Sweden's Burzum. The Norwegian black metal scene in particular in the 1990s has been widely documented due to its members' proclivities for arson, burglary, Nazism, homophobia, and murder. And in general, metal's aesthetic and discursive fixations eschew the leftist philosophizing of punk rock in favor of horror, gore, Satan, paganism, and the occult. And another key difference between punk and metal is the music itself. So punk is the reputation of punk, at least, is that anyone can do it. Anyone can pick up a guitar and write a song with 4 chords. But heavy metal is built on a highly technical musical foundation, and it requires almost virtuosic skill in order to get up on a stage and expect people to pay to listen to you. And I also know that Indigenous musicians have been present in heavy metal since its inception. Groups like Testament, Anthrax, and Metallica all have Native American members. And Rez Metal has grown even more in recent years. There's bands like Suspended out of the Navajo Nation, Black Braid and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Alliance, pictured here in the San Carlos Apache Reservation, have all come into increasing prominence in the past few years. Rez metal bands often center themes of colonial history and Indigenous self-determination, which are readily communicated in song and album titles like Black Braids, Barefoot Ghost Dance on Blood-Soaked Soil, and the Dene Rockabilly Outfit, the Rez Tones, Custer Had It Coming. Speaking to the power of the transformative power of Rez metal, former president Jonathan Nez of the Navajo Nation said that not many, and I quote, "Not many people are into metal here on the Navajo Nation, but there are some that are peeking out and wanting to grow their hair long again." So for Rez metal bands, the genre's fixation on violence and the macabre is often recontextualized into colonial histories and their ongoing effects on Indigenous people. So Rez metal bands don't have to talk about stupid stuff like Satan and witches and ghosts and things like that. They're just talking about their lives and their histories and their aspirations, and it maps on quite well to the sort of brutalist architecture of heavy metal and transforms it into something restorative. So speaking on specific bands, moving on to specific bands, M.I.S, this band is Alliance. I encourage you to check them out. They did a guest lecture here at Hampshire last semester, and they're just for as heavy as their music is, just the nicest people you've ever met. And they love to hear from you. M.I.S. Describes themselves as a native concept band with the purpose of putting Indigenous issues at the forefront of their explosive attack. They understand that their band is a rallying point for transnational Indigenous movement building, and their members come from a variety of tribal nations. M.I.S. used the confrontational aesthetic forms of heavy metal to bring attention to the legacies of warfare and dispossession that continue to affect Native communities. And this intentionality is reflected in their own name, the name of the band. M.I.S. is short for Merciless Indian Savages, and that is how Indigenous peoples are described in the Declaration of Independence. So growing out of the colonial project, colonial education is a key theme in M.I.S's music, and as are its provenance in the colonial project. Colonial education can be similarly indicted for its abject disrespect for Indigenous lifeways, histories, perspectives, and aspirations, and historically that eradicative philosophy lay at the root of the Indian boarding school system, which sought the forcible removal and miseducation of Indigenous children from every corner of the U.S.'s sphere of imperial conquest. The flagship residential institution was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was moored in founder Richard Henry Pratt's belief that for Indigenous children, compulsory schooling was needed to kill the Indian in him and save the man. And the refutation of Pratt's mission inspired M.I.S's album title, Kill the Man, Save the Indian, as did their opposition to eradicative schooling. So in M.I.'s music is a critique of Western concepts of education and social life that are predicated on the Hobbesian notion that all human beings are ultimately self-interested creatures in competition with one another for dwindling resources. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, which I think is a better description for third graders than existence. When they form the bedrock of modern nation states, colonizing logics like that metastasize into capitalistic paradigms that value economic surplus over sustainable development, environmental stewardship, and human rights. Indigenous, Blackened, and racialized peoples, however, have always contested the imposition of settler logics in their lives in the same way that many Indigenous families and tribal councils resisted boarding schools and agitated for their closure. In some cases, entire communities would relocate to fields outside of the schools to be near their children, a phenomenon famously documented in a photograph of an Oglala camp pitched outside of a residential school in Pine Ridge. So while the consequences of its epistemicidal mandate reverberate today, the boarding school system's mission of eradicating Indigenous knowledges ultimately failed. Indigenous peoples have continually found ways to honor their ancestral and place-based lifeways while demanding the rights accorded to them under the frameworks established by treaties and international law. So while simplified and broad, this analysis of schooling and colonial schooling in particular is necessary for understanding the decolonial underground pedagogy of M.I.S. So in an interview with Dr. Kelvin Dan of the Rez Metal podcast, M.I.S's lead singer Corey Ashley described his experience navigating a predominantly white institution, specifically Stanford University. And he described a university that seemed to be haunted by the ghost of colonialism's past and the specter of emerging colonialities. Ashley notes a specific classroom interaction, which was doubly injurious. First, it trivialized the exploitation of Havasupai tribal citizens who donated blood samples to Arizona State University with the expressed intent of helping the tribe identify genetic markers for diabetes. The university, however, had the tribe sign a broad and generic consent form, which led to other researchers using the samples to study other diseases and to link the tribe to prehistoric migrations from Asia. And those studies, undertaken without the informed consent of the community, exacerbated ongoing traumas while insulting the oral histories and creation stories that form an integral part of Havasupai knowledge and that tie the Havasupai people to their rightful and ancestral homelands. So they did an activity where they're debating whether or not that was okay. And the students had to take sides and argue each point there, take the side of the tribe and take the side of the university. So as a classroom activity, that discussion would benefit from a sensitive and measured approach that affirms the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and a tribe's right to informed consent, along with an unequivocal recognition that this right had been violated. But in that interview, Ashley talks about how the course, its instructor, and its non-native students were quick to trivialize those concerns by framing the controversy strictly as an intellectual debate. So what happens in a learning environment like that is that it becomes okay to sublimate Indigenous ways of knowing to a white majority educational setting where collective traumas, like those imposed on the Havasupai people, are reduced to inert objects of ponderance, like a periodic table or a scale model of an esophagus. And to that end, Ashley's experience reflects that the violence of colonization is not a distant memory, but one that Indigenous students continue to navigate daily in higher ed. So M.I.S. released their first album, this one here, Kill the Man, Save the Indian, in 2020. And the album's title track synthesizes all of this critique, all of this lived and learned experience, all of these very fresh traumas associated with colonial education. And their song with the same title serves as both a critique and a call to action. I'll read some lyrics here. White man did come across the sea, brought us pain and misery. Will we find the strength to break free? Only good Indians are dead, they say. We said, fuck that, and continue to pray. Couldn't kill us off. Long live our ways. And kill the man, save the Indians. Explosive attack is not limited to its lyrics. So here's where the understanding of metal as a pedagogy comes in, because its instrumentation reflects classic forms of thrash metal, which is a percussive genre of heavy metal that historically colonized and racialized people had a big influence in developing. Thrash is indebted to hardcore punk as well, and it's grounded in heavily distorted staccato guitar riffs played at breakneck speed. And M.I.S's brand of thrash makes prominent use of double bass drums, playing something not unlike medicine drums in double time. But M.I.S's drums reproduce the heartbeat of a broken world, diseased and damaged, but still alive and still here. And the lower frequencies associated with bass guitars, those that create warmth and intimacy, are largely absent. So in their totality, what M.I.S. has created in this song sounds a lot like machine gun fire or a war zone. And Ashley's vocals are woven into this soundscape, and it completes a picture of defiant vitality in the face of extinction, reminding us of the enduring permanence of Indigenous lifeways. He sings, "No longer will we be blind to white worlds that corrupt our minds. Kill the man, save the Indian. Kill the man, save the Indian." So even though M.I.S. began as a response to a stifling climate of predominantly white academia, a longer view positions the band within an ancestral continuum of Native American artists seeking solace in communities of interest that allow individual embers of ancestral knowledge to blossom into new cultures, aesthetic forms, material worlds, and oceans of possibility. When conceptualized as third spaces of sovereignty, heavy metal, Rez Metal, can be understood as an emergent curriculum and a reparative educational space. And while these pedagogies exist outside of the surveillant and pathologizing gaze of colonial schooling, they also emanate from second spaces like the Native American Cultural Center. They can incubate and create a refuge for the creation of third space. So this is sort of glossed over it in the talk, but this is something that the university can do and support in order to seed this kind of generative informal learning. So while the historical legacies of genocide and forced assimilation continue to affect Native American communities, M.I.S's origin story and artistic portfolio show how the legacy of principled and unwavering resistance to colonial miseducation marches onward. A decolonial and respectful education environment could still broach traumatic histories, but that inquiry shouldn't stop at inert critique, and it should instead encourage learners to understand the inherent impunity of colonial statecraft and its contemporary forms. I gave a talk on this kind of same subject with a group of undergraduates and asked them if they had ever had to, in their schooling experiences, if they've ever had to have a debate where they defended slavery, where they defended Jim Crow, where they defended other forms of genocide. And 2-1, they all raised their hands. So it shows me that what happened with this exercise that Jacob Ashley from M.I.S. is describing is still very much considered like a best practice in U.S. education. And it's important that we attend to the harms and are intentional about pursuing healing. If you want to teach kids to debate unpopular positions, have them defend hot dogs are better than hamburgers. Dogs are better than cats. Have them do stuff like that. Don't recolonize folks in the process of developing cognitive skills, you know. But as long as institutional life continues to reproduce colonial logic, countervailing waves of organizing and art making will be needed, and will step up to actualize reparative alternatives. Third space explorations in subculture and education help us understand that educational justice is not a simple matter of intentions or strategic goals. It involves interrogating the colonial provenance of dominant, nominally common sense understandings of what teaching, learning, and education are, and their function in our lives and communities. So heavy metal bands have long explored themes of healing from trauma through resilience, oftentimes calling for an inspiring collective and reparative practice. And for Indigenous youth, heavy metal communities offer a sense of belonging and support for those who may feel isolated or marginalized in other spaces, and therefore increase their risk of further isolation. So that's why they demand recognition as vital spaces of learning and healing. Institutional and governmentally sanctioned attacks on multicultural education, however, along with critical theory, critical race theory, and the celebration of non-dominant knowledge traditions in formal school settings make it so that, you know, some of our students, some of our youth might only ever encounter a decolonizing education in subculture. So further entreaties into subcultural third spaces of sovereignty should inform strategies that address the complex needs of contemporary students, even if these strategies need to be obfuscated and smuggled in undercover in order to combat the ever-present threats of institutional surveillance, state scrutiny, racialized policing, and colonial violence. And it's happening. Rez Metal bands are doing just that when we conceptualize their work using these lenses. But despite all this momentum, we still live in an environment where organized attacks on Indigenous education, on ethnic studies, on comprehensive sexuality education, on queer theory, on critical race theory, and the few avenues that allow our students to engage in the tenuous exercise of freedom make it so that they might only ever encounter holistic and healing forms of education in communities of interest that they build for themselves. So that reminds me that my central research question remains unanswered. How do we decolonize education? How do we practice insurgent, emergent, resurgent pedagogies of our sovereignty in our classrooms, in our relationships, in our communities, and toward ourselves? There's a lot of work to be done. But I hope we can do it together. So to this end, I invoke the words of Rewi Maniapoto, a Māori Ariki or chief, and an ancestor of my dear friend Wairehu Grant, scholar and musician from one of Aotearoa's only Māori punk bands, and they're called Halftime. After being surrounded by British forces at the fortress of Arauco in 1864, a colonial emissary approached Rewi to negotiate the terms of a surrender. And to this, he responded, "E hoa, e kaore mo te rongo, ka whawhai tonu mātou, mo te ake, mo ake, ake." So when it comes to ensuring liberation, sovereignty, and self-determination, there will be no surrender, and we will fight forever and ever and ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was so insightful. It was an amazing, amazing presentation. So now we will open it up to the floor to have any questions that you might want to ask Noah about his presentation and his work. Please raise your hand and I will call on you.
Noah, I'm really interested in your work. Sorry, again, I didn't raise a hand, but just got to start.
How dare you?
Thinking. This is, yeah, it's really interesting. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about like the second space as opposed to the space.
Yeah, I realized that was cut and not copied out of my prepared remarks. But yeah, the way Broyneil described it, and thank you, Lois, for the question, is the first space is kind of the space of dominant culture. And then a second space is the response, the sort of sanctioned official response, the treaty partner, I guess. So a second space would be, first space would be Indigenous peoples' correspondences with the U.S. government. The second space then is the tribal government and the services and opportunities provided therein. So in a university setting, it's kind of like the first space is the university itself, the dominant aspects of it, and then the second space is the sort of concessions that the university gives to minoritized students and faculty and staff. So the example there would be like a Native American Cultural Center, a Gay Straight Alliance, things like those are the like official sanctioned second space. And oftentimes they're insufficient, oftentimes they're underfunded, oftentimes they're a threat of closure. But they also serve this important like tertiary function of incubating refuge, sort of fugitive spaces where Indigenous students can create something else outside of and have a measure of protection from the gaze of the first space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Shari, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that.
No, you're good. Thank you so much. Noah, really appreciate your talk today. I've been thinking about third spaces. They've come not in an academic setting, but definitely in a personal setting. And so this has been very illuminating. What attracted me to this talk was this idea of resistance and how it can take place and shape using various modalities, in this case, metal. And I thought that was fascinating. Still on the conversation around first spaces, second spaces, and third spaces. How, two questions. One, do you think that it is necessary to have both second and third spaces? Could one override the other? So meaning if we have this first space that obviously has a history of dehumanization and oppression, could we skip, jump, and go into the third space just in case the second space could be eliminated because of the first space? Are you still following me? Could the third space, and the third space being a space of that's community ran, dictated, and governed, could that be where maybe we spend most of our energy and our time for resistance, just in case if the second space can become obsolete at any point, any political regime, any, insert event?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is yes. And thank you, Sherry, for that. I really appreciate that question. Very thoughtfully considered and presented. And yeah, I think, at least in my experience, yeah, absolutely. The third space is where a lot of our youth spend their lives because it is the space where they can be unapologetically themselves. I think there's an element of, the first space, and to a certain extent, the second space will always be there. It's the dominant culture in particular. Eurocentric capitalism and colonialism, they're here. This is the thing that has overdetermined the architecture of our lives and our worlds and the terrains that we navigate to an extent. But there also needs to be an accounting for the agency of Black, Indigenous, and person of color youth in particular. Yeah, what I've found in studying subculture is folks will always exercise their sovereignty and self-determination, even in the tightest of spaces. And I guess as an education researcher, what I like to do and what I encourage other education researchers to do is to pay closer attention because there's lots of really generative and important praxis happening there. And I try to forestall like interpretation or coming to any conclusions about that. I think it's enough to just celebrate the intersubjective and subjective healing that is happening in third spaces.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your reply.
I do see a question in the chat. I don't know, Megan, I didn't know if you were able to unmute.
Oh, yes. So Norma would like to know, do you engage with Chicana ex-feminist scholars, like in Zaldua's conceptualization of the third space from feminist lens?
Hi, Norma. Not enough, to be honest. That I've been meaning to fully read Borderlands for like 6 years now, and Chicana and Chicanx literature on decolonization and like mestizaje and indigeneity is something that that I'll admit is a blind spot for me in terms of my like lit reviewing, and I'm definitely going to. I will say that I'm very something I always like to put out there is that punk rock is and my heater is really loud and it's cold, so that's why I threw this jacket on. But punk rock is widely understood as the white dominated space, but a lot of its aesthetic, a lot of its sound was pioneered by Alice Bag, as a Chicana musician who was doing punk way back in 1976, so a year before the so-called like inception of that. So these liberation, these decolonial underground pedagogies, these subcultures, heavy music, subcultures in particular, owe not just a lot, but in a lot of ways everything to Chicana elders. And then Alice, I think it's telling that Alice Bag went from like being a punk OG and is now an elementary school teacher. I think it all kind of goes back to like, as education researchers, there's a lot for us to engage with in the underground. And there's a lot more for me personally to engage with as well. And I'm going to see you in a couple of weeks, so I'm going to definitely have some questions for you.
So I was just wondering, like, you know, with your question on how do we decolonize education, I was thinking about like tuck and yang as well. And like decolonization is not a metaphor, and kind of I'm wondering like I think it looks different because you're looking at spaces of sovereignty, like that third space of sovereignty. But I'm just curious, like about sort of, yeah, I guess sort of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, but I just taught Eve and Wayne's article in my class last week. I'm trying to remember the cool things students said about it. But yeah, I think there is that element that is not it's almost like that incommensurability between decolonization and social justice, right? Like decolonization requires the rematriation of stolen lands and the and at the very least, well, not at the very least, but at the yeah, it requires the resurgence and rematriation of stolen land and lifeways, and that's something that is, you know, impossible to reconcile with colonial schooling, you know, and the different ways in which that has sort of evolved and been normalized in the now, right? So there is that. But there's also, I guess, coming from a Philippine perspective, there's also decolonization is is quite a bit is quite slipperier. Because you could say that we did get our land back. But what happened is that we just had to deal with new colonialisms, with new colonizations, with the fact that now there's not boots on the ground, but there's different kinds of coercion and power being exerted onto Filipino people from the same metropoles, right? So for me, it's kind of like decolonization has to hold all of that into balance. It's or what thinking about even Wayne's writing reminds me of is that really we have to do all of it. We have to decolonize, we have to liberate the land, we have to ensure that that there's even like piecemeal reparations, like cultural easements and reciprocity agreements, and just normalized relations between colleges, universities, and tribal nations need to be in place. Like those are the things that we can do now in pursuit of this broader resurgence. But there's also that internal work of we need to acknowledge and understand how colonial epistemologies and ways of doing have sort of constrained our agency. So there's that internal work that still needs to happen of living a different kind of way, living in a good way, living in a relational and reciprocal way. And when you start thinking of it like that, then all of a sudden it's more or what I encourage students to do is when you think about it like that, you can see what you can do about it now. It's you can't tell a 19-year-old undergraduate that they have to give the land back. That's to me at least, that's kind of like they just tune out at that point. But when you tell them that that's what you're working toward, and there's got to be something you can do to seed that in the future, there is something you can do now. You can find a place where the land has survived when it shouldn't have, and you can appreciate it. You can find a place where the water is stuck and is trying to get back home to the sea, and you can help it along. And then all of a sudden, with enough practice, that becomes how we go about our lives, how we go about our day, and we're actively decolonizing all the time rather than working toward a finite end goal. And to me, that's kind of a generative and useful way of seeing things. It gives me hope in the day-to-day, at least, if that makes sense.
So much.
I think that concludes our guest speaker series with Noah Romero today. Thank you again so much for coming on and talking with us today. This was an absolutely amazing talk. Very interesting subject. I was nodding my head like along the whole time. It was very, very cool topic. So yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all so much for being here.